What's going on, everyone? So last night I made a video talking about kind of the initial impressions of the results for the first planetary qualifiers that we've had. But today we actually have a lot of data to talk about and kind of continue the discussion of the most dominant performance that we potentially have ever seen of one leader and of one deck. It was pretty crazy. Now, before we get started, big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. Thank you for supporting the channel, and thank you for just, well, hanging out with me. Also, I have a TCG player link in the description down below if you guys want to pick up any of the cards, especially for Bobo Green, because clearly he is just super strong right now. And before we get started on the data discussion, I want to mention a lot of the kind of compilation of data was really made easy because of this site behind me, which I've been using for a little while now, and that is Star Wars Unlimited Competitive Hub. I'll leave a link to it in the description down below if you guys want to check it out yourself, but they do a great job of kind of giving all the top eights, cataloging it in one place, showcasing where these are coming from, either streams or YouTube, Twitch, whatever it is, so you guys can check it out all yourselves, watch the tournaments yourself, etc., etc. But I've also broken this down even further into a pie chart that we'll be going over a little bit later on in the video, showcasing how dominant Boba actually has been. Now, as of today, as we said earlier on in the video, there's one planetary qualifier that has yet to finish, but 6 other ones that have finished. Now, I didn't get the full top 8 breakdown of this Canadian tournament. I do know that the winner was a Han Green, but I have tried to pull together all the other ones that I have so far in terms of top 8s into a pie chart. And you could see, of the ones that we see here, there were 4 Boba Greens that took down a tournament, 1 Iden Blue, and 1 Old Han Green. Old Han Green. So this was an absolute crazy performance. We're talking about 4 of the 6 finalists for some of the most competitive tournaments in the world for Star Wars Unlimited, taken down by a single deck. And these are very similar. As far as I could see, all of them were 30 HP bases. There's no like ECL variant. These are the standard Boba Greens that we've been talking about for pretty much the past month. At this point, the list was something that we knew about for the entirety of set 2. And of course, Boba ECL was completely dominant in set 1. But this is starting to come back, at least over the past week, and solidified itself potentially as the best deck tier 0 in the format right now. Now, there are a lot to talk about outside of that, not just the finalists for Boba Green and the fact that it took down a bunch of tournaments, but the fact that it also represented a massive portion of the top 8 overall. And that's what I made my pie chart out of. So what we'll do is we'll hop over to that image here just to kind of talk a little bit more about where the meta is at. So here you can see behind me, might be a little bit hard to see down below in the in the little boxes and the text, but on the chart, you can see we've got 11 Boba Green in the top 8 of, I think this is cataloging 5 of the PQs because I could actually showcase all the top 8s. But 11 Boba Greens, 4 Boba Yellows, 1 Boba Blue, and 1 Boba Red in the top 8s, representing a total of 17 Boba Fett lists across 5 planetary qualifiers, which is 40 top 8 players. So 17 of the 40 players were playing Boba Fett as their leader. That is almost a 50% meta portion of Star Wars Unlimited being dominated by Boba Fett. And mind you, of this 17 that we're talking about, 11 of those are Boba Green, which means that 11 out of 40, if we do some quick percentages here, that is close to 30% of the overall meta in terms of top 8 finishes for Boba Green. So this is a massive showing for Boba Fett. Mind you, most of the other lists, as you can see here, are representing a couple of the top 8 finishes, potentially kind of not necessarily off meta, but a little bit lower in value. Like if I were to put this on a tier list, like tier 0 would be Boba Green, tier 1 would maybe be like the Boba Yellows, the Sabine Greens, maybe you could put Sabine Green in the tier 0 portion as well, because she did absolutely amazing as well. But then all the other lists that we're considering here are tier 1 or maybe even tier 1.5 lists. There's not any list that comes close to Boba Green and Boba Fett as a leader in terms of top 8 finishes. The next closest leader is Sabine. And I spoke about this last night in my video, that Boba and Sabine are going to be the leaders to be choosing for these tournaments. They have consistently shown up, they have consistently performed well, and when it came to the most competitive tournament with the most competitive decks, guess who showed up yet again? Boba Fett and Sabine, with Sabine taking 6 Sabine Green top 8 finishes and 1 Sabine Yellow top 8 finish. So there's definitely a clear favorite in terms of Sabine, similar to Boba. Yes, Sabine Yellow looks to be pretty viable, and we've talked about that in the past. But Sabine Green seems to be the obvious choice, and it really, really showed up with also close to 20% of the meta being Sabine. So between Boba Fett and Sabine, you can see it in terms of pie chart. If you just cut straight down the middle, this would be 50%, right? More than 50%. More than 50%. Close to 60%. In fact, what is it? 17 plus 7. That means 24. That's straight up 60% of the meta in terms of the 5 PQs that we're talking about today being Sabine or Boba Fett. The last 40% is divvied up amongst a couple of leaders, actually, or a few different leaders. But Boba and Sabine by far taking the most out of these planetary qualifiers. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about why I think that is. But first, I want to talk about some of the other finishes that we've had. One of the finishes, as you saw, actually taking down a whole tournament was Iden Blue. And within that tournament, there was also a Rey Red player. We had 2 Han Yellows. That's the OG Han. We had 2 Han Greens. This is new Han. 4 new Han Blues. And then 5 Kira Greens. Now, again, I didn't get the full Canadian top 8. I only got 3 of the deck lists. So I just left that out. But if I were to include those ones, then it would also have included the new Han or OG Han Green taking down a tournament. But regardless, there's not that many leaders that are competing. And if you remember my previous video talking about, I think, again, the video was called The Boba Problem. I mentioned Boba Fett, I mentioned Sabine, and I mentioned New Han. And these are the decks, number 1, number 2, and number 3 in terms of performances from leaders, right? Boba Fett, 17 spots. Sabine, 7 spots. New Han, 6 spots in the top 8s of these planetary qualifiers. Kira coming up really close with 5 spots. And then OG Han's got 2. Again, slightly changed because we would have included any future PQs, and that might bump up the numbers for some of these. But also 1 Iden Blue, or 1 Iden and 1 Rey, which seem to be a little bit more outliers. I wouldn't consider Rey Red or Iden Blue top of the meta by any means. I would have considered those definitely tier like 1.5 tier 2 decks, and maybe Iden Blue even lower than. But because of the meta disposition, I am not surprised to see Iden in the meta and finishing quite well. Now, what do we have here in terms of archetypes that are showing up in top 8? Because yes, we've got Boba Green, Boba Yellow, Boba Blue, Boba Red, Sabine Green, Sabine Yellow, all this stuff. But what does it mean in terms of archetypes? Well, Boba Green is again, what I would consider quintessential mid-range deck. I spoke about this in my previous video when I talked about destroying your store showdowns. Boba Green is the deck that I would choose for the best option for your mid-range deck. And it really does perform well, mainly because Boba Fett itself is just such a strong leader that ramping a little bit and going for your value plays in Maul and Darth Vader doesn't hurt you that much because you have such a powerful leader to support that game plan. Now, with this, alongside Boba Green, well, you could put Han Blue, new Han Blue that is, in the mid-range category. But for the most part, I think the only other one that would kind of fit in that mid-range category would be Boba Red. But even then, that's slightly more aggressive, as it's usually leaning to some space units and using Triple Dark Rain and such to kind of close out the game. I don't have all the lists, by the way. This is just the general kind of idea of these lists. The other option would be New Han Green. Again, I haven't seen the list, but this can go two ways. It can be a hyper aggro deck or more of a mid-range ramp, get Crate Dragon down early with all the ramp that you have option. So I suppose you could include that with the Boba Green mid-range strategy. However, in terms of aggro lists, and if you want to include tempo in that, that would include Boba Yellow, Sabine Green, Sabine Yellow, Boba Red, New Han Green, Han Yellow, all of which kind of fall into the same category or similar categories. We got 4, 5, 11, 12. Han Green again can go multiple ways, so maybe 14, 16 lists. So definitely more aggro dominated. And that's one of the reasons why Boba Green is performing so well, because it's super strong against a lot of the more tempo aggro focused decks. And the main reason for that is you just have such a powerful leader that you get down so early that the tempo decks really have a hard time dealing with. You can waylay a random unit, you can waylay Lieutenant Schildson, you can go ahead and discard a bunch of random events like Overwhelming Barrage with Bodhi, you can go ahead and disrupt your opponent by exhausting a bunch of things. When it comes to leaders, they are very persistent, very hard to deal with, and usually, well, in Boba's case, a solid stat line, especially with Boba's case, coming down way earlier than you might expect, which is part of the problem. The other list that we've got, Iden Blue, is definitely the only hard control list that I would put on this list. So only one hard control, not seeing any Bosk Blues, which is very interesting to me. But if you want to consider soft controls, these are going to be the Han Blues, the Kira Greens. That's a total of 9. And the Rey Red tends to be a more soft control list. We have 10 soft control lists. We have kind of an even split. Like each taking about a third of the pie chart here in terms of aggro tempo, mid-range, and soft control. So we have the controlling variants, the mid-range variants, and the aggro variants. But by far, the majority of the list tends to steer towards the more aggressive decks, and that's why Boba Green's showing up so much. Now, if this continues to be the case, and we do see a lot of aggro decks coming in with Sabine Greens, the Boba Yellows, and all that type of stuff, well, Boba Green is going to do super well, and people are going to be bringing Boba Green. But if Boba Green starts to become the dominant archetype, and again, Boba Green is not the dominant archetype because mid-range in of itself isn't actually greatly represented on this list, and that's just a testament to how powerful Boba Fett as a leader is, well, then we might see a little bit of a shift towards more hard control lists, because we kind of have a rock, paper, scissors sort of meta in which the Boba Greens, the more mid-range style of decks, the slightly more higher value oriented plays tend to not do super well against these super hard control lists. The aggro lists tend to do a little bit poorly against Boba Green because of how powerful that list is, how much value you can generate, and how much you can counteract some of the early plays. And then with that, aggro tends to do pretty well against, well, the soft control lists, as you don't have enough healing and any kind of controlling of the board to deal with all the aggro plays, and yet you still also want to get down plays of your own, which can allow some of the aggro lists to kind of really run you over or outplay you, especially with Sabine Green having ECL Wrecker, ECL Poe. If you're relying on units, they could sometimes be, well, immediately killed, and that can be pretty brutal. So a little bit of a rock, paper, scissors meta. And again, I say that slightly because Boba Green does have just a solid win percentage in general. Even the unfavorable matchups for Boba Green aren't like 70-30, 80-20. Generally, we've seen just a slight advantage one way or the other. Except in Boba Green's case, when he has the advantage, it is heavily in Boba's advantage. And again, this comes down to just simply having an extremely high stat leader following up with an extremely low to deploy cost, alongside the ability to leverage additional resources in terms of potentially 8 resources on the turn he comes down to allow you to catch up. And this is what makes that mid-range deck function. If you're trying to play like Luke Green or like Rey Green, for example, these are tending to be a little bit more mid-range, more higher value. You just struggle to get to your leader flip. You struggle to be able to come back in the game, and you struggle to actually generate enough value even in the later game to potentially close out the game before you get overwhelmed or outvalued, etc. Boba Green does not have that problem because of Boba Fett. It is literally just because of Boba Fett. So this is really indicative of some of the more universal leaders taking a dominant position in the meta. And it's not just Boba. While he is absolutely representing a massive portion of the meta, Sabine also has a similar thing going for her in that any sort of aggro list that you're looking to get and play and dive into, Sabine just seems to be the default leader because of, well, her ability to come in really quickly at a 4 to flip, guaranteed damage on the action, and just amazing setup with the aspects that she's in. Alongside that, New Han also falls in the same category that Boba Fett and Sabine are. Who would have thought the top 3 represented leaders in the terms of PQ top 8s are the leaders that have just generally powerful abilities that are the go-to for a lot of different options. And in Han's case, it generally is going to be that soft control, being able to play higher value plays that can't just get overwhelmed by Sabine, that can't just get overvalued by Boba Green, etc. You are able to be represented in the top 8s of these PQs. So very, very interesting to see. And this breakdown definitely reinforces some points that a lot of people or at least were concerned about, and that is Boba Fett in particular, and whether or not he's going to be a dominant performance, and whether or not Boba himself is a mistake. Some people talk about the actual ability on him with the ability to generate additional resources, and some people talk about just the 4/7 stat line, etc. Alongside that, a lot of people are still upset about Sabine. Just the fact that she comes in and is that aggro dominant leader is kind of just, I don't know, a universal bland ability alongside Boba that doesn't really do anything necessarily unique. And the same thing goes for New Han. Now, I will mention, when you're considering these more competitive tournaments, the people who are actually playing in these tournaments, generally speaking, they aren't as worried about, oh boy, the meta is in complete shambles, the game is completely unbalanced, and I don't like it. It's usually the loud minority that's talking about these things, mainly because the people who are competitive players just play within their competitive sphere and they deal with whatever kind of balance that the game has to offer. That said, that's not to say that competitive players don't want the meta to necessarily change because of one statistical anomaly or another. And heck, even the Dallas PQ winner in the interview that we watched with the Buckethead stream, he mentioned that the game is pretty unbalanced, and it is partially due to, or a good chunk of it is due to Boba Fett. And so when we're looking at this and we're seeing Boba Fett is responsible for, well, with 17 lists, 40%, a little bit over 40% of the meta, we by far have a statistical anomaly. Even just considering Boba Green being close to 30% of the meta, this is not something that typically happens in other card games where one deck is this dominant, and it does lend itself to be that Boba Fett is a little bit of an anomaly in terms of, well, whatever you want to rate it, stat line at the flip cost, the ability itself on a very powerful leader, the combination of the two, the aspects that he's in, or maybe just the amount of support he's gotten with cards like Boba Fett's armor that specifically reference Boba Fett. It does seem that alongside Boba, there just seems to be a lot of specifically designed cards for Boba, leaning for him to be a little bit better. And I don't think with just Boba Fett as the leader, without the additional support of specific cards designed for Boba, we would be in this spot. If you look at some of the other decks like New Han, like Sabine, they kind of just use cards. They just use cards that kind of fit in the strategy that they want to go for. Boba uses two cards in particular that specifically reference Boba or his unit, and that is, Fett's Fire Spray, that literally references Boba Fett, and Boba Fett's armor that does some absurd things when you put it on a Boba Fett unit. That could be the leader or the small unit. We don't really have these types of cards for the rest of the leaders in the game. So that is something that's really interesting to consider, in that if they are planning on designing some of these specific cards for specific leaders, they may want to double check and make sure that these cards aren't letting themselves to favor a specific leader going forward. Or I suppose if you don't think that this is necessarily a problem, maybe they just design whatever works and we'll just see how it goes, right? And if one leader takes a large chunk of the meta, then that might be okay with you. We do have some other cards that are designed for specific leaders as well, such as Vader's lightsaber, such as Luke's lightsaber and things like that. But for one, those leaders didn't really get too much support in set 2. But also, there's not multiple cards for a specific leader necessarily, alongside already being an overstated for the deploy cost, alongside a very powerful ability, and the combination of them all can lead to something like this. And the question is, at the end of the day, what does everyone think about this meta? Because this is something that most likely will be even worse come next week, the weeks after, when we see other PQs, because people are going to look at this and they're like, yeah, you know what? When I'm going to this PQ, I was deciding between Nuhan Blue, Sabine Green, or Boba Green, and just by nature of statistics, it looks like Boba Green might give me the best shot. Or the reverse might be true, is people are saying, oh, Boba Green's going to be in the meta, I'm going to bring some, whatever it is, Item Blues, Boss Blues, the hard control decks that might have a better matchup against it. And so the meta is going to kind of shift around this, and there might be a situation where the meta kind of figures itself out because of a dominant performance from Boba Green, and then the result of this is going to be that rock, paper, scissors where, okay, rock's super powerful, we got to bring more paper in, and we solve ourselves out over the course of time, because while we have seen the meta shape up, we have not seen a meta or a tournament of this caliber with this amount of competitive stakes on the line to where people are taking it as seriously as they have been with these planetary qualifiers. And again, it shows, because every single list here is a list that I would consider to be one of the better ones in the game, with the exception of potentially like Boba Blue and Boba Red. Every single one of these I would have put in like the A or S tier. Maybe Iden Blue, depending on the meta as well. Maybe that would have been lower A or higher B tier for me. But every other list is up there. And that's not necessarily true for all the cash tournaments and store showdowns that we've seen, where we see random Fennec Shans, we see random, CAD blues, CAD greens, whatever it is. This is definitely more indicative of a competitive environment. So I'm very curious to hear what you all have to say. And of course, I'll be providing updates as we get further on along the meta and along the competitive sphere. But I know that that I will be diving into some Boba Green more and more. And I have a little bit of a sneak peek where I got to play with another creator on Carabast with Boba Green. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all for the next one.